There is a spreadsheet open on a desk in Chicago. 43 rows. Not one of them solves anything. The man staring at it has been awake since 5. His daughter needs tuition money he doesn't have. His car needs a part he can't afford. And in 11 minutes, something is going to happen that will change every calculation he has ever made about his life. The elevator doors on the 38th floor open. Heels on concrete. Precise. Unhurried. The sound of someone who has already decided. A cream envelope lands on the desk. Heavy stock. Black calligraphy. His name, her handwriting. She leans down. 4 words barely above a whisper. Words that don't belong in any spreadsheet he has ever built. He looks up. She is already walking away. He looks at the envelope. He doesn't open it yet. He already understands that once he does, column C will never look the same again. The spreadsheet had 43 rows and not one of them was going to fix the alternator. Brian Carr knew this. He'd known it for 20 minutes. He kept staring at the numbers anyway, because staring at numbers was the one thing in his life he could do without anything going wrong. Column A was income. Column B was fixed expenses. Column C was the gap between those two things. And column C had been negative for 6 months running, and that was fine. That was manageable. He was managing. Except the alternator was $340 he didn't have. Except Nicole's spring tuition installment was due in 11 days. Except the coffee in the Whitfield logistics break room tasted like someone had filtered hot water through a cigarette butt, and Brian had drunk 2 cups of it this morning because he needed to be awake for this spreadsheet, and now he was jittery and underpaid and staring at a number in column C that looked back at him like a personal insult. The office floor hummed around him. Tuesday morning hum. The specific frequency of 40 people pretending to be productive. Dave from accounting cleared his throat 3 desks over that wet, apologetic sound Dave made every 12 minutes like clockwork. The copier on the far wall was doing whatever the copier did when no one was watching it, a low mechanical grinding that had been escalating for 2 weeks, and that nobody had reported because reporting it would mean interacting with facilities, and facilities made you fill out a form. So the copier ground on, and Brian stared at column C, and the alternator waited. He was 32 years old. He had a data analyst job, a 6-year lease on a car that was actively falling apart, $14,000 in credit card debt that he did not enjoy thinking about, and a daughter at Northwestern, whose scholarship covered exactly half of what Northwestern cost, which was Northwestern's version of generous and Brian's version of a math problem that kept him awake at 3 a.m. He was not unhappy. That felt important to be accurate about. He was not unhappy. He was just doing the calculations constantly, all day, every day, the way some people listen to music in the background, a permanent low-level arithmetic running underneath everything, checking and rechecking the margins. He had learned to live inside the calculations. They were just the texture of his life now. The envelope landed on his desk without warning. He felt it before he saw it, a soft, decisive weight on the corner of his keyboard. Cream-colored, heavy stock, the kind of paper that costs more per sheet than his lunch. His name was written on the front in black calligraphy, actual calligraphy, not printed. Someone had taken a pen and formed each letter of Brian Thomas Carr, with the kind of deliberate pressure that meant this envelope had been prepared by a person who did not rush. He looked up. Laura Whitfield stood at the edge of his cubicle. This was not a thing that happened. Laura Whitfield did not come to the analyst floor. The analyst floor was 3 levels below her natural habitat by both elevator and organizational chart. She existed in the executive suite where the carpet was thick enough to swallow sound, and the air was kept at a temperature that felt like a mild rebuke. She came down for quarterly all-hands meetings, and not for any other reason in the 6 years Brian had worked here. And yet here she was, standing in the gray industrial light of the open-plan office, in a charcoal suit that had probably been constructed by a person in a room with no distractions, her hair pulled back into a knot so severe it looked structural, not decorative, load-bearing. She was looking at him with an expression that contained no information whatsoever, not irritation, not warmth, Not the preliminary softening that people do before they say something human. Just assessment. The same look she gave the quarterly projections before she started circling numbers in red. He became suddenly aware of the coffee stain on the cuff of his shirt. "My wedding," she said. Brian looked at the envelope. He looked at her. He looked at the envelope again. "Congratulations, Miss Whitfield. Read it carefully." She leaned forward slightly. Not much, the kind of lean that communicated precision rather than intimacy, and her voice dropped into a register that the open plan office couldn't reach. "You're coming as the groom." The ambient noise of the floor disappeared. Not literally. Dave was still clearing his throat. The copier was still grinding. But Brian's brain executed some kind of emergency triage and decided that all of that could wait. Would you treat them with kindness? That the only sensory input that mattered right now was the sound of what had just been said to him, and the absolute absence of anything on Laura Whitfield's face that suggested she was joking. She wasn't joking. He knew she wasn't joking, because Laura Whitfield did not joke. This was not speculation. This was 6 years of observed behavior. She didn't do the office holiday party. She didn't do birthday cakes in the break room. She had once walked past the Halloween decorations that Sandra from HR put up every year and looked at the paper skeletons with the specific expression of a person encountering evidence of a belief system they found intellectually incomprehensible. She was not capable of this kind of joke, which meant she had just said it, and meant it. "My office," she said, already straightening, already turning. 5 minutes. Her heels clicked against the polished concrete floor in a rhythm that sounded like a decision being made. A few people at nearby desks had been watching. Brian could feel them not watching now, the performative return to screens that meant everyone had seen. Dave was staring at his monitor with the focused intensity of a man who had heard everything and intended to process it in the parking lot at lunch. Brian looked down at the envelope. He picked it up. The paper was warm from something: the room, her coat, the sheer thermal energy of whatever meeting it had come from. He turned it over. The back was sealed with a wax circle, dark blue, pressed with what looked like kindness. Looked like an initial, but he couldn't tell which one without his reading glasses, which were in his desk drawer under a pile of charging cables, and he was not going to spend the next 30 seconds fishing for them. He slid his thumb under the flap. The wax broke cleanly. He pulled out a single card, same heavy cream stock, same calligraphy. Centered. Precise. "The pleasure of your company is requested at the marriage of Laura Claire Whitfield to Brian Thomas Carr, a date 6 weeks from Saturday." Brian put the card back in the envelope. He put the envelope in his desk drawer. He closed the drawer. He stood up. He took the elevator because his knees had made it clear they were not going to manage stairs right now. The executive suite felt like a different country. The carpet absorbed his footsteps entirely. The light was warmer up here, less fluorescent accusation, and more the soft glow of places where decisions got made over good coffee. Laura's assistant, a composed woman named Cheryl, who had seen everything and gave nothing away, looked up from her desk and said, "She's expecting you," without Brian having to say a word, and gestured toward the heavy oak door. He pushed it open. Laura was standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows, her back to the door, looking out over the gray Chicago grid below. The city sprawled in every direction, flat and relentless, winter still holding on in the dirty margins of sidewalks, where the snow had turned the color of regret. She didn't turn around. "Close the door." He closed it. The oak met the frame with a sound that was final in the way that expensive things are final. Is this an HR exercise? It wasn't really a question. He said it flat, because flat was the only register he trusted himself to use right now. "Because I want to be clear that whatever this is, I have no interest in." "It isn't." She turned. She walked to her desk, a slab of reclaimed wood that probably had a story behind it, probably a good one, probably not the moment, and sat down. Her chair was the same height as the visitor chairs, which Brian noticed because it was the kind of thing you noticed when you were looking for something steady to notice. "Sit." "Shh. I have a deadline at noon. You have 3 minutes. Sit." He sat. She opened a folder. Manila, ordinary, the kind you got at any office supply store. Except its contents were not ordinary, and Brian understood that in the 2 seconds before she started reading from it. She laid it on the desk between them like a document being entered into evidence. Nicole Ann Carr, she said. 19. First year at Northwestern, communications major. Partial scholarship, 44% of annual tuition. You've been a single father since she was 13. Her mother relocated to Oregon and maintains no financial relationship with either of you. She looked up, back down. You earn $82,000 annually. You carry $14,000 in credit card debt, primarily accumulated from a period 18 months ago when your income was reduced due to a departmental restructuring that didn't affect your title but cut your bonus by 60%. Your car needs an alternator. You calculated this morning that you cannot afford both the repair and Nicole's spring installment payment on the same paycheck. The silence was the specific kind that happens after someone has said something true out loud that you have never said to anyone. Brian's hands were flat on his knees. He kept them there. You ran a background check on me. Not angry. Just identifying what had happened. I reviewed detailed profiles on 74 male employees at this company. She corrected it without apology, the way you correct a math error. You were the only one who met all the criteria. What criteria? Stability, discretion, no legal history, no social media behavior that could become a liability, no romantic entanglements that would complicate the arrangement. She folded her hands on the desk. Her nails were unpainted. Her ring finger was bare, a demonstrable history of putting someone else's well-being consistently above your own. Brian absorbed this. You're describing a doormat. I'm describing a man I can trust. She said it without hesitation, which is rarer than you're making it sound. She stood. She walked to the window again, not away from him but sideways, like she needed to think in motion. He waited. Whitfield Logistics is in the final stages of a $2.3 billion merger with Hartwell Group. She kept her gaze on the city. We've been working toward this for 4 years. The deal closes in 8 months. When it does, it secures the financial future of this company. For the next 2 decades, 3,000 jobs, supply chain infrastructure across 11 states. It's the most significant transaction in this company's history. Okay, my uncle Timothy holds 30% of voting shares. Would you treat them with kindness? He's been positioning himself on the board for 2 years, building alliances with older members who were appointed when my father ran the company. Last month, he submitted a formal request for a board review. Under a clause in our original 1986 corporate bylaws, a clause requiring the CEO to demonstrate, quote, demonstrated personal stability prior to executing a transaction of this magnitude. She turned. Timothy's interpretation of that clause is that I don't qualify because I'm unmarried, without what the language calls a demonstrated foundation of personal continuity, which in 1986 meant a spouse and a mortgage. Brian looked at her. That's antiquated, sexist, legally questionable but not legally indefensible, which is the specific combination of things that makes it dangerous. She came back to her desk. She didn't sit. She stood behind her chair with both hands on the back of it, a posture that was neither relaxed nor tense, but somewhere in between that looked like controlled force. My lawyers spent 6 weeks looking for a way around it. They couldn't find one that would survive a challenge before the merger window closes. The bylaws were written by my grandfather in 1986, and they've never been formally amended and now because no one anticipated that they'd be used this way. Timothy is not wrong that the clause exists. He's wrong about everything else, but the clause is real. So you fight it through the board. I've counted the votes. Timothy has 7 members he's cultivated over the past 2 years. I need 8 to override his challenge. I have 7. She said it precisely, not dramatically. The way you report a number, that is what it is. And if you get married, the challenge collapses. The clause is satisfied. The merger proceeds. Timothy loses the only legal mechanism he has. She looked at him steadily. I don't need a fairy tale. I need a fact that holds up in a boardroom. Brian was quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere far below, a horn sounded in the street. Chicago going about its business indifferent to what was happening in this particular room on this particular Tuesday morning. Why not hire an actor? Actors have agents. Agents talk. The entertainment press has sources in every talent agency in this city. And I cannot afford a leak before the merger closes. She pulled the folder toward her and extracted a single printed page, setting it on the desk between them. You won't leak. Because leaking requires deciding that the money matters more than what the fallout would do to Nicole's future. And you're not built that way. He looked at the paper. Numbers in clean black type. His eyes found the top line first. The specifics of the trust structure and the monthly arrangement were beneath it. But he was still on the first number when she spoke again. $2 million, placed into an irrevocable education trust in Nicole's name, accessible to her at 25, or earlier for qualified educational expenses. Additionally, a monthly amount paid directly to you beginning on the date of signing, to cover among other things alternators and spring tuition installments. She sat. You continue working here. You receive an immediate promotion to VP of Analytics, which you've been passed over for twice in circumstances that had more to do with departmental politics than your performance, and which you therefore can defend to anyone who asks. After 24 months, we file for an uncontested divorce. You walk away. Nicole's future is secured. Your life resumes. The grandfather clock that Brian had never noticed before ticked from somewhere behind him. $2 million. He did not let himself feel what that number meant. Not yet. Because, if he felt it, he would say yes before he'd read anything, and he was not going to say yes before he'd read the actual document. Would you treat them with kindness? And also because there was a thing she hadn't addressed yet, and he was going to address it himself before she had the chance to make it a clause. Nicole. He said it before she could redirect. She doesn't become part of this. Laura's expression shifted by approximately nothing, but something behind her eyes registered the statement. People will expect me to have some familiarity with. No. He kept his voice level, even. The same voice he used when mechanics tried to upsell him on things his car didn't need. Nicole is 19 years old. She grew up without a mother. Not because her mother died, because her mother chose to leave and didn't look back. Nicole has spent 6 years learning not to attach to people who aren't going to stay. If you spend 24 months in proximity to her and then disappear because the contract expired, she won't understand it was a business arrangement. She's a smart kid. She'll know something happened, but she'll feel it like she wasn't worth staying for, and I will not do that to her. The silence that followed this was different from the earlier silences. It had a texture to it. Laura looked at the folder. Not at him. At the folder. Would you treat them with kindness? And something in the set of her jaw shifted, a tightness that wasn't quite the professional composure she'd been maintaining, but also wasn't vulnerability, exactly more like the brief flicker of a person who has just heard something they recognize from a distance. The way you recognize a place you've never been because someone described it to you once with enough accuracy. She reached into the interior pocket of her jacket. She produced a silver pen. She opened the folder to page 14, found the clause that addressed Brian's engagement with her in family-adjacent settings, read 2 lines of it, and drew 2 hard diagonal lines through the entire paragraph. She initialed the margin. She slid it back across the desk. You're the primary parent. That doesn't change. Her voice was quieter than it had been. Not soft, just quieter. I'm a busy executive. I work late. I travel. Nicole knows you're married and she knows who to. Beyond that, I will not attempt to perform something I'm not. She paused. I am not built for that kind of performance. Brian looked at the crossed-out paragraph. He looked at her. I want a lawyer to review the full document before I sign anything. I'll have it in your personal email by end of business today. My personal email. Not your work account, obviously. He stood up. His knees held. That felt like a small victory. Give me 48 hours. You have 24. She picked up her phone from the desk. The meeting was over. This was just how she communicated endings, by looking at the next thing. The narrative needs to begin building before next weekend. There's a charitable gala at the Art Institute Saturday. The board will be there. Timothy will be there. We need to make our introduction. He was almost at the door. Brian. He stopped, he turned. She was still looking at her phone, but she'd stopped scrolling. You were the only one of the 74 who left drawings on his desk. She said it, without ceremony, without looking up. Nicole's artwork from high school. You've kept them for 3 years. I noticed that before I looked at any of the financial data. He didn't answer. He wasn't sure what answering would mean. He left. The contract arrived at 5:47 p.m., 41 pages. Brian made pasta for dinner, the kind that came from a box, because you treat them with kindness. Because he was thinking too hard to cook anything that required attention, and sat at his kitchen table in the apartment that he'd been renting for 4 years in a neighborhood that was gentrifying around him like a slow tide, slowly making everything he knew more expensive, and he read every page. The document was comprehensive in the way that only fear produces. Every contingency had been anticipated. Public displays of affection, defined, calibrated, limited. Social media conduct, an appendix. Procedure for press inquiries, a decision tree. Living arrangements, 2 floors of her Lincoln Park penthouse, separated by a hallway, and the contractual assumption that they would treat each other with the professional courtesy of colleagues who shared a building floor. He found Clause 9 on page 18. He read it twice, then a third time, because he wanted to be sure he was reading what he was reading, and not what he feared he was reading. The second party agrees that all representations of the marriage, including representations made to immediate family members of the second party, shall conform to the agreed narrative for the duration of the contract. He sat with that for a long time. Nicole was 19. She was studying how language worked, how narrative worked, how the stories people told about themselves either held up or didn't. She was sharper than Brian was at the same age, sharper in the ways that mattered, and she would look at him across a dinner table, and she would know. Not maybe. She would know. Would you treat them with kindness? Because she was his daughter and he had never successfully lied to her about anything more significant than whether Santa Claus was real, and she'd figured that out at 7 without any help. Clause 9 was asking him to lie to Nicole for 2 years. He stared at the number at the top of the trust document. Then he stared at Clause 9. Back and forth. The way you look at 2 things that cannot both be true. He picked up his phone and typed to the number she'd included on the contract cover page. We need to talk. Not at the office. She replied in under 90 seconds, the Bristol on Maple. 8 o'clock. He typed back, Tom's Diner on Clark. 8 o'clock, a pause. Longer this time. He could picture her looking at the name of the diner. Then, fine. She walked in at exactly 8. The bell above. The door chimed, and the 6 people in the diner turned to look, because Laura Whitfield walking into Tom's Diner at night was the kind of thing that caused involuntary attention. She was wearing a camel coat over a dark dress, her hair still up, and she looked at the cracked vinyl of the booth, before she slid in with the careful deliberateness of a person choosing not to react to something. You're establishing a power dynamic, she said. I'm establishing reality. He pushed a mug of coffee toward her. Black, already poured. She looked at it. Clause 9. It's a standard confidentiality. It's not. He said it without heat. Confidentiality is you and me not telling anyone. Clause 9 says I have to actively construct a false narrative for my daughter. That's not the same thing. Nicole is an adult. She's 19. She's 19 and she's been figuring out how to trust people who might leave since she was 13. He leaned forward. I told you in your office that she wasn't going to be part of this performance. Clause 9 makes her part of it. Because if I'm feeding her a story she hasn't consented to, I'm using her. And I won't. Laura looked at the coffee. She hadn't touched it. If Nicole tells anyone, Nicole's isn't going to tell anyone. He said it with the certainty of a man who knew exactly one person absolutely. She's my kid. She doesn't gossip. She doesn't do social media beyond the minimum. Would you treat them with kindness? She's going to look at me and figure out something's going on. And when I tell her the shape of it, not every detail, but the shape, she's going to make a decision about whether to back me up, and she will. Because she's 17 times smarter than I am, and she understands that sometimes people make calculated decisions for good reasons. Laura was quiet. He reached into his jacket, pulled out the folded contract, opened it to page 18, and clicked his ballpoint pen, the cheap one from the office supply cabinet, not the silver instrument she'd used in her office, and drew a line through clause 9. He slid it across the table. She looked at the line, at his pen, at the table for a moment, which was sticky in the specific way that Tom's diner tables were always slightly sticky, and she didn't seem to register the stickiness, which told him she was actually thinking rather than managing her environment. She picked up the document. She crossed out the crossed-out clause with her own line, more deliberate, more definitive, and initialed it. She slid it back. She knows it's an arrangement, Laura said. Not the legal specifics, but the basic structure. The basic structure. And she doesn't discuss it with anyone. She won't. Another silence. The cook in the back dropped something metal. Someone at the counter laughed at something on their phone. The diner went about its business around them. Laura picked up the coffee mug. She looked at it for one additional second, and then she drank from it. She didn't grimace. She set it down. Saturday. The gala. Her voice returned to its operational register. The Hartwell board members will be there. Timothy will be there. We need to appear not performative. Comfortable. The kind of comfortable that takes time to build and can't be faked in a week. How does one appear comfortable? By not trying to appear comfortable. She looked at him directly. Just don't perform. Don't try to be the version of yourself that belongs in a room like that. Just be the version you actually are. He looked at her. The version that analyzes data and fixes his own gutters. The version that stood in my office and told me exactly what he wouldn't do. She set her coat collar down. One small, precise adjustment. Timothy is very good at finding the performance underneath the performance. He's been doing it for 40 years. The only thing he can't dissect is something that's actually real. So you want real. I want whatever portion of real we can manage. She stood, pulling on her coat. The tuxedo will be ready Thursday. Mr. Rossi on Michigan Avenue. He knows your measurements already. You measured me. I had your suit tailored last year for the company anniversary event. The records were in HR. She buttoned the coat. Thursday, 6 o'clock. Don't be late. She left a 20 on the table for a $4 coffee and walked out without looking back. He signed the contract the next morning. Thursday came. The tailor's shop on Michigan Avenue had no window display, just a black door with a brass handle and the particular atmosphere of places that expected you to already know why you were there. A man named Rossi met Brian at the door, with the tape measure already around his neck, assessed Brian's posture and proportions in approximately 3 seconds, and began moving around him with the efficiency of someone who had long ago stopped being interested in conversations. Laura sat on a velvet chair against the far wall. She had a tablet in her lap. She was not pretending to look at the tablet. She was watching Rossi work. Would you treat them with kindness? Brian, he couldn't tell, and the three-way mirror showed him too many angles of himself to want to look at it for longer than necessary. Stand straight, she said at one point, without looking up. I'm standing straight. Your right shoulder is lower than your left. It's a habit from carrying things on one side. Compensate. He compensated. Rossi made a sound of mild approval. When they were back in her car, black, quiet, a driver named Marcus, who did not acknowledge that they existed, and whom Brian appreciated enormously, she handed him a small velvet box. He opened it. Inside was a platinum band set with a diamond that caught the dim light of the car interior and fractured it into small, precise points across the ceiling. Estate piece, she said before he could speak. Belonged to a great-aunt who died in 1994. You had it reset. That's the story. It means no one can trace a purchase. And if someone asks why a data analyst's great-aunt owned a 4-carat diamond, your family had a different kind of money before a different kind of time. It's vague enough to be unverifiable and specific enough to sound like the truth. She was already looking at her phone. Saturday, 7 o'clock. The car will be here at 6:30. He put the ring in his coat pocket. It sat there for the rest of the day, like a small significant weight he'd agreed to carry. Saturday arrived with rain. Not gentle rain. Chicago in March, deciding to make a point. cold and driving and turning the streets into black mirrors that reflected the headlights of other people's cars in long, distorted streaks. Brian stood in front of the mirror in the east wing of the penthouse, his temporary room, larger than his entire apartment, with a bathroom that had more surfaces than his apartment's bathroom, had square footage and worked on the bow tie. He was not good at bow ties. He was becoming less good at this one specifically. The tuxedo was extraordinary. He knew nothing about tuxedos, had owned exactly 0 of them. But he knew that this one was different from the rentals he'd seen at other people's weddings, the way it sat, the way the fabric held its shape without pulling, the midnight blue so dark it was almost black except under direct light, where it shifted into something richer. It was a garment constructed to make the person inside it look like they were supposed to be wherever they'd ended up. He understood for the first time why people spent money on clothes. Not vanity, architecture. There was a knock. He opened the door. Laura stood in the hallway. She was wearing a gown the color of deep emerald silk that moved like liquid, the back cut away entirely in a clean architectural line that stopped Brian's train of thought in the middle of whatever sentence it had been forming. Her hair was up in a different configuration than her office arrangement, still controlled, still deliberate, but with more intention in it, like a weapon that had been upgraded for a specific purpose. She looked him over, top to bottom. Professional assessment. Possible, she said. It took him a second. Possible. You look fine. You'll read as credible. She turned, started toward the elevator. Come. He followed her. In the elevator, she stood on her side of the car and he stood on his, and neither of them said anything, and the only sound was the soft mechanical descent of 30 floors. You look beautiful, he said. She didn't turn around. Don't overdo it. I said it once. Save it for where it counts. The car deposited them at the Art Institute entrance, where a red carpet had been assembled, and photographers were already positioned in the practiced crouch of people who did this for a living. Laura took one breath, singular, controlled, like a diver before entry, and then she was transformed. The smile appeared, genuine seeming, radiant, the specific warmth of a woman who had learned that cameras required this thing and had mastered it. She threaded her arm through Brian's. Don't look at the cameras, she said quietly. Look at me, or look at whoever we're talking to. Looking at cameras makes people look like they're looking at cameras. He looked at her. How do you do that? Do what? Go from standing in an elevator to. He gestured slightly, indicating the version of her that the cameras were currently recording. That. Repetition. A flashbulb went off. She didn't blink. By the time you've done it enough times, it stops feeling like a performance. It just becomes one of the faces you know how to make, he thought. That's one of the saddest things I've heard in a long time. He did not say this. He smiled at a camera instead. Inside, the Art Institute's grand staircase hall had been arranged for 300 people. Soft lighting and round tables, and a string quartet playing something that required no opinion about it. A waiter appeared with champagne. Brian took a glass and drank more of it faster than was appropriate. Pacing, Laura said beside him. Working on it. Timothy is at the far table. 10 o'clock. 3 board members with him, Mitchell, Grayson, and Sandra Webb, who has been with the board since 1999. And whose vote I cannot currently predict. Her voice was so low it barely qualified as sound. She smiled at someone across the room. We need to move through the room and reach them naturally. Not immediately. Let them watch us for 20 minutes first, and in 20 minutes, we go say hello. They work the room. She was extraordinary at it, moving with the ease of someone who had been trained in a craft. Would you treat them with kindness? Smooth transitions from one conversation to the next, deflecting questions she didn't want to answer with questions of her own, filling any silence before it could become significant. Brian followed her rhythm, offered handshakes, responded to the inquiries that came his way. Whitfield Logistics VP of Analytics. Recent promotion. Yes. The merger was looking strong. Thank you. Yes. Chicago winters. Ha. And he watched her work and thought, this is what 10,000 hours looks like. Timothy found them first. He materialized, from the direction of the bar with a scotch in his hand, and the patient momentum of someone who had been waiting and had decided the waiting was done. He was heavier than Brian had expected from Laura's description, solidly built, with a shock of white hair and a face that had been shaped by decades of sitting across tables from people and not blinking. His tuxedo was correct in every detail. His eyes were the kind of pale gray that looked at you and took inventory. Vivian. He used her given name, not Laura the full version, formal, the one that put her at 11 years old in a boardroom. I was beginning to think you'd skipped the evening. We were running behind. Laura's voice was immaculate. Brian, you remember my uncle, Timothy. Brian remembered nothing of the sort, because they'd never met. But he offered his hand, and Timothy took it with the grip of a man who measured things by handshakes, and had already started his measurement. The data analyst. Timothy's eyes moved over Brian without hurry. Remarkable elevation under the circumstances. The VP role had been open for a while. Brian kept his voice level, conversational. He wasn't performing ease. He was just saying the thing that was true. The timing worked out. I'm sure it did. Timothy took a sip of scotch. I have to say, Laura, this is entirely unlike you. A whirlwind office romance. A wedding in 6 weeks. You're not typically a woman who acts on impulse. Everyone's allowed one. She smiled. It was flawless. Timothy looked at Brian. Direct, unhurried, the inventory continuing. Tell me, Brian, what does a man in your position actually have in common with my niece? Genuinely. I'm curious. The question landed in the air between them. Brian felt Laura's arm tighten slightly through his. The board member Webb, 3 feet away, pretending to study a painting, was not pretending to study a painting. He didn't smile. He didn't reach for charm. He thought about what was true, honestly. Not much, he said it simply. Not as a confession, just as data. She watches films I fall asleep during. I think the best meal in this city costs about $12 and comes from a truck on Wacker. We don't have overlapping tastes in anything I can think of. He paused. But I've worked 3 floors below her for 6 years. I've watched her be them with kindness. The last one in building on a Tuesday when everyone else went home. I've seen her handle a client crisis that would have ended most people and not let a single person on the floor know it was a crisis. She carries 10,000 people in this company every day, and she doesn't talk about it, and she doesn't ask for credit. He looked at Laura for 1 second, not performing, just looking. I carry 1 person. My daughter. That's my whole category of understanding. But it's enough to recognize what it looks like in someone else. Timothy was very still. Webb had stopped, not looking at the painting. I don't need to have things in common with her, Brian continued. I just need to understand what she's doing. And I do. The silence stretched. The string quartet shifted into a new piece somewhere behind them. Timothy looked at Brian with something that was not what he'd had in his expression. When he arrived, not warmer, Timothy Whitfield didn't do warm, but calculating in a different direction now, recalibrating rather than confirming. Well, Timothy finished his scotch. The word came out measured, neither concession nor victory. You certainly found one with something to say, Laura. We'll see if that holds. He nodded with the minimal civility of a man exiting a conversation on his own terms and moved away into the crowd. Brian let out a breath. His hands were not entirely steady. He tucked them into his jacket pockets so it wouldn't show. That wasn't on a script card, Laura said quietly beside him. I just wanted him to back off. She didn't respond immediately. He glanced at her. She was looking at the side of his face with an expression he hadn't catalogued before, not the assessment face, not the performance face, not the executive face. Something that was none of those things, something smaller and more careful, like a person who has been moving very fast and has just encountered something that made them stop. Her hand moved, just slightly. Her fingers brushed his lapel, not a press-ready gesture. Cameras were on the far side of the room. There was nothing to perform for. Just a reflex. Just a hand reaching towards something solid. She pulled it back almost immediately. Her expression returned to what it was supposed to be. The first dance will be expected around 9, she said. Her voice was precise again. Operational. We should eat something. He followed her toward the tables. He was thinking about the way she'd touched his lapel and immediately stopped touching his lapel. The unconscious reach and the conscious withdrawal. And he was thinking that Timothy was right about exactly one thing tonight. This was entirely unlike her, and unlike him. And neither of them had a clause for that. The wedding happened on the 3rd Saturday of March, in a private event room at the Langham Hotel, and it rained the whole day, cold and persistent, the kind of Chicago rain that felt like the city had made up its mind. 280 guests, a string quartet, 3 photographers and a videographer that Laura's PR team had selected for their discretion as much as their portfolios. Brian's best man was a guy named Kevin from the analytics floor, chosen because Kevin was the one person at Whitfield who asked no questions anyone didn't want answered and who showed up to things when he said he would. Timothy was in the front row. He sat with perfect stillness, arms crossed, watching the proceedings with the patience of a man who had decided to let time do what arguments couldn't. Brian stood at the altar in the midnight blue tuxedo and held the ring in his left hand and tried not to inventory everything that was happening too specifically, because specific inventory was what his brain did when it was afraid. Would you treat them with kindness and set it to the side, the way he'd learned to set things to the side when there was something that needed to be done right now and the feelings could wait? Laura appeared at the far end of the room. There was no veil. She'd been specific about that in the planning conversations. No veil, no train, nothing that required management. The gown was ivory silk, structured, with a silhouette that communicated intention rather than sentiment. She walked with a posture that was her natural posture, precise and upright, not the soft drift of a woman in a traditional ceremony, but the decisive forward movement of a person who had decided to enter a room and had entered it. The whole room was watching her. Brian watched her too. She reached the altar. She turned to him. Up close, away from the photographers and the guests, and Timothy's calculating stillness in the front row, he could see what wasn't in the photographs. The faint violet shadows under her eyes that 3 weeks of wedding logistics on top of a merger had produced. The way her jaw was set not with confidence, but with the specific tension of endurance. The fact that her hands, when she placed them in his, were cold enough that he felt it through his own. He held them. He just held them, not performance, not Clause 4, Section B. He just held her cold hands in his and looked at her. And after a second, her eyes found his instead of the middle distance she'd been aiming at. The efficient said the words that efficients say. The PR team's vows were read, crafted language, clean and legally appropriate, and completely devoid of any sentence that meant anything in particular. "I, Brian," he said, and then he looked at her, and he finished the sentence, and the words were the vows and nothing more. But he looked at her steadily all the way through them. Not performing steadiness, just staying. Her turn. She said the first 4 words, and then stopped, almost imperceptibly, the fraction of a pause that probably no one in the room caught because it was too small. But he caught it. She was somewhere else for that half second, not present. Then she came back, her eyes finding his again, and she finished, "I do." Quiet, like the word was hers. Not the PR team's. They exchanged rings. The platinum band settled onto his finger with a weight that was neither comfortable nor uncomfortable. Just real. Timothy in the front row uncrossed and recrossed his arms. "You may kiss the bride." Brian leaned in. She closed her eyes. 2 seconds. Her breath was warm, and she smelled like champagne and something underneath that was just her, and then it was done. And the room erupted into the sound of 300 people applauding. And the photographers were already moving, and the next 4 hours began. By 11, the band was playing slower things, and the floor had cleared to a handful of couples. Laura appeared at Brian's shoulder, having survived 4 hours of Timothy's orbit, and 279 congratulations. "First dance," she said. "Photographer needs the shot." He led her out to the floor. His hand went to her waist, her hand went to his shoulder. They were in the correct positions, and the cameras were angling toward them, and the music was doing what the music was doing. 5 more minutes, she said quietly. "Then we're finished. You're doing well." I have a headache that has been escalating since the ceremony, and my shoes were designed by someone who has never worn shoes. Her voice was barely audible. Don't compliment me on my performance right now. I wasn't complimenting the performance. A pause in the rhythm of her swaying. Barely perceptible. Turn your back to the cameras, he said. I can't, they have what they need. I'll block the angle. Just turn. He shifted, rotating slightly so his jacket fell between her and the nearest photographer's line of sight. Let go for 30 seconds. You've been holding it for 4 hours. She didn't, for a moment. Then something gave way. The smallest controlled surrender, and her forehead came down against his collarbone, and her weight shifted into him by some real percentage, and he put his arm a little tighter around her shoulders, and they swayed. She let out a breath against his jacket. Quiet. Like something that had been trapped and found the first available exit. Thank you, she said against the fabric. Barely there. Part of the arrangement, he said. And even as he said it, he knew he didn't mean it. He thought about Nicole's voice on the phone last week. You sure about this, Dad? And what he'd said back, I read the whole contract. And what Nicole had said, that's not what I asked. The song ended. They separated. Her hand left his shoulder. His left her waist. The cameras caught the last 3 seconds of them standing close before they stepped apart, and whatever the photograph showed of that moment, Brian knew it wasn't the thing that had happened. He was married to his boss. He had $2 million in trust for his daughter. He had a room in a penthouse on the north side of a city where it was raining and had been raining all day. He had 24 months and a document that outlined exactly how they would end. He put his hands in his pockets and walked off the dance floor and thought, this was a clean, simple transaction. And I understood what I was agreeing to. He almost believed it. The machine ran perfectly for 11 weeks. Brian knew because he had been counting. Not obsessively. Just the way you count things when you're a data analyst, and counting is the closest thing you have to control. 11 weeks of the shared calendar app. 11 weeks of the professional distance that the contract implied without stating outright. 11 weeks of appearing at exactly the right events at exactly the right intervals, and leaving at exactly the right times and saying exactly the right things to exactly the right people. 11 weeks of the penthouse, operating like a well-managed corporate building, where 2 tenants shared common areas by silent, negotiated scheduling, and never once created a situation that required the word feelings to be used. It was working. That was the thing. It was actually working. The Whitfield logistics stock had stabilized within 3 weeks of the wedding photographs hitting the press. Not spiked, stabilized, which was the more important thing. The thing that meant the underlying anxiety had been addressed rather than just temporarily suppressed. Business press coverage had shifted from the speculative to the supportive. 3 board members who had been in Timothy's column had begun returning Laura's calls with the renewed promptness that meant they were reassessing their positions. The merger timeline was holding. Brian had spent those 11 weeks becoming a VP of analytics. This was more complicated than it sounded. He hadn't been given the role as decoration. Laura was too precise to offer a promotion that would become an obvious target for anyone looking for evidence of the arrangement. So the role was real. The responsibilities were real. And Brian, who had been performing at VP level for 2 years while being paid and titled otherwise, found that the job fit him the way the tuxedo had fit him. Like something made for him that he hadn't known existed. He had direct reports now. 6 of them. He had a glass-walled office on the executive floor that he found profoundly uncomfortable in the first week and deeply useful by the 4th. He had access to the merger datasets that the analytics floor had never touched, and he spent the first month of the marriage quietly identifying 3 inefficiencies in the integration projections that the deal team hadn't caught. He sent a memo. Laura read it. She forwarded it to the deal team with 1 line. Address these before Thursday. They addressed them before Thursday. Nobody said anything to Brian about this directly. But on a Friday afternoon 3 weeks in, Laura's assistant Cheryl appeared at his office door, set down a coffee from the Good Place, 2 blocks over, not the break room battery acid, the actual Good Place, the one Brian had never bought from because $5 for coffee was a luxury in column B, and left without explanation. He understood this was a signal of some kind. He drank the coffee. He kept working. So the machine ran, and the penthouse was large enough to contain 2 people with the correct combination of schedule management and mutual restraint. Laura was gone by 5 in the morning most days, back by 9 or 10 at night, and they intersected in the kitchen for approximately 4 minutes each morning in an overlap window that Brian had not engineered, but had also not avoided. They were civil, professional. They discussed the week's scheduled appearances over shared calendar updates. They ate exactly 2 dinners together per week, which was the number the PR team had determined looked authentic without looking staged, and they conducted those dinners in a way that was neither warm nor cold but functionally indistinguishable from how 2 people who had known each other for years and had run out of urgent things to say looked from the outside. It was exactly what they'd signed up for. So Brian couldn't explain why. Some mornings he stood in the kitchen after Laura had gone and looked at the second coffee cup drying on the rack. She'd started rinsing her own cup rather than leaving it for the housekeeper. Would you treat them with kindness? And he had no idea when that had started and felt something that was not quite right about the word transaction. He stopped thinking about this by making himself look at the spreadsheet instead. Thanksgiving arrived in the way. Thanksgiving arrives in Chicago gray sky, the smell of cold off the lake, the city getting quieter in preparation for the long indoor months ahead. Nicole took the Metro in from Evanston on Wednesday afternoon. She had a rolling suitcase and a tote bag full of the specific detritus of first-year college life, books and chargers, and an oversized sweatshirt from a university she wasn't attending, which she explained by saying she'd traded with someone named Priya from her communications theory seminar, and Brian said he was glad she had friends. And Nicole said, "They're not friends yet, we've just done one trade," with the precision of a person who considered vocabulary important. She stood in the penthouse entrance hall and looked up. 30 feet of ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows, a piece of sculpture in the corner that was worth more than Brian's car had been before the alternator incident, and that neither he nor Nicole had any particular opinion about. "Dad." She turned in a slow arc, taking it in. "You sleep here, every night. In an actual room, 2 of them. I haven't used the second one yet." Nicole looked at him with the assessment face she'd inherited from no one he could identify, certainly not from him. He'd never looked at anyone that precisely and said, "Where is she?" "East Wing. Working." "Does she know I'm here?" "She knows you're coming. I told her Wednesday." "Okay." Nicole set down her suitcase. She looked at the sculpture again. "That's an interesting choice. I haven't touched anything in the main areas." "Good call." Laura appeared from the hallway that led to the East Wing at 6:43, which Brian noted because he hadn't expected her that early. She was still in work clothes, the armor down to the last detail. Nothing conceded to the fact that it was the night before a holiday. She registered Nicole in the entrance hall. Nicole registered Laura. The 2 of them looked at each other for approximately 4 seconds, which was 4 seconds longer than Brian found comfortable. "Nicole." Laura's voice was its operational register. No inflection added for the occasion. "Ms. Whitfield." Nicole's voice was polite, a fraction more formal than her usual register, which meant she was actively managing something. "You can call me Laura." "Okay?" A beat. "Laura." And then they were both in the kitchen, because dinner needed to happen, and Brian was making the only thing he made well under pressure, which was pasta with the jarred marinara that he improved enough with garlic and red pepper that it was better than it had any right to be. "Would you treat them?" And Nicole was sitting at the kitchen island doing reading for a class that had assigned reading over Thanksgiving break, which Nicole considered characteristic of academia as an institution, and Laura had her laptop open at the far end of the island and was working and occasionally accepting a glass of the wine Brian had opened, and nobody was performing anything because there was nobody to perform for. This, he realized, was the most normal the penthouse had ever felt. It lasted through dinner and into the dishes, and then Nicole said she was going to call someone from her dorm floor and took her phone to the guest room. and Brian was putting the pan away when Laura closed her laptop. She's observant, Laura said. She's studying communications. They teach them to read rooms. She's been reading this one since she walked in. He put the pan on the hook and turned around. Laura was still at the island, laptop closed, which was unusual in itself. She held her wine glass by the stem, not the bowl. Precise even at rest. She's not going to cause problems, Brian said. I didn't say she was. Silence. The kind that had started to have a different texture than the silence of the first few weeks. The first week's silence was the silence of two people who had nothing to say to each other that wasn't in the contract. This was something else. He couldn't define it any better than that. She called you Laura, he said. I told her to. You tell everyone to call you Ms. Whitfield. She's not everyone. She took a sip of wine. She stopped. Whatever she'd been about to say, she redirected. She has your way of looking at a problem. Brian didn't say anything, because that observation, delivered in Laura Whitfield's flat, neutral register, was, somehow, the most complicated sentence she'd said to him since he'd walked into her office and found a folder about his alternator on her desk. The next morning was Thanksgiving, and Nicole got up at 9 and immediately began being curious about the espresso machine, which was a logical curiosity in the way that all large, intimidating objects prompted curiosity in Nicole, who wanted to understand how things worked before deciding whether she approved of them. Brian was explaining that the machine had defeated him, personally and consistently, when Laura appeared from the West Wing at 9:43 later than her usual departure time, which meant she wasn't leaving for the office on Thanksgiving, which was somehow a piece of information Brian hadn't thought to have, and walked past both of them to the machine, executed a sequence of steps that took 30 seconds and produced two perfect espressos, set one in front of Nicole and one in front of Brian, and went back to the East Wing. Nicole watched her go. Then she looked at the espresso. Then she looked at Brian. She made it for both of us. I see that. She didn't make one for herself. Brian looked down the hallway where Laura had gone. No. Interesting. Nicole drank the espresso. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually answer it. I usually actually answer things. You hedge. You refrain. It's a thing you do. She set the cup down. Is this a real marriage, or is it a thing that made sense for reasons you haven't told me? He had rehearsed for this question. He'd rehearsed 3 different versions of an answer that were technically true and selectively incomplete, the way you do when you've agreed to a shape of honesty but not its full dimensions. None of the rehearsed answers came up. It's a thing that made sense for reasons, he said. The arrangement benefits both of us. It's not what it looks like from the outside. Nicole nodded slowly. She had the face of a person confirming a hypothesis. Okay, Nicole, Dad, I'm not upset. She picked up the espresso cup again. I'm just figuring out what to call it so I can think about it correctly. You made a decision, and you had reasons, and the reasons were probably about me, at least partially, and I'm not going to make that harder than it needs to be. He stood with that. The weight of having a 19-year-old be more measured about this than he'd managed to be himself. Just tell me one thing, Nicole said. Do you actually respect her? He didn't have to think about it. Yes. Okay, she finished the espresso. Then the rest is details. He almost told her then about the amount in the trust, about what the board challenge meant, about Timothy and the bylaws and all of it. He almost said, here is every detail. Here is why I made this choice. Here is what I couldn't figure out how to give you any other way. He didn't, because Nicole had given him a door, and he understood it was a door she was choosing not to walk through yet, and he trusted her sense of timing more than his own. What he didn't know, because he had no way of knowing it. Would you treat them with kindness? Was that Nicole spent 40 minutes that afternoon, standing in the kitchen alone, while Brian was helping a neighbor with something in the hallway, and Laura had emerged briefly for coffee and was standing at the window with her mug, and Nicole had said not asking, just placing it in the room. He talks about his work differently since the promotion, like he's actually using the right size container for the amount of water he has. And Laura had turned from the window and looked at Nicole. with the expression that Brian was coming to recognize as her version of being caught off guard. And she had said, "That's an accurate observation." And Nicole had said, "You noticed it too." And it wasn't a question. Brian found out about this conversation later, much later. The way you find out about things that happened between people you love in pieces, out of order, assembled gradually into something that changes what you thought you knew. March became April. April held. The machine kept running, and Brian kept not thinking about the second coffee cup on the rack, and life proceeded with the specific momentum of things that are going well on every measurable axis. Then the Tuesday happened. 2:17 a.m. The particular cold of a Chicago April night that hadn't yet gotten the memo that it was supposed to be spring. Brian was asleep. Deeply, actually asleep for once. The kind where you're gone enough that the phone ringing enters the dream first as something else. A doorbell, a car alarm, before his brain properly identified it as his phone and made him reach for it with the urgent lurch of every parent who has ever received a call after midnight. Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Nicole Carr. Minor vehicle accident. Non-life-threatening. Fracture of the right distal radius. Currently stable. Please call. He was dressed before he understood he had decided to get dressed. T-shirt, jeans, one shoe on before he realized he needed the other. The apartment hallway was dark. He was already moving toward the front door when he registered the light under the east wing door, thin, pale, the blue-white of a laptop screen. 2:17 a.m. And she was still working. He pushed through the hallway toward the front door. He was doing the calculation. Rideshare would be 9 minutes. No. Call a cab, no. It was 2 a.m. In April in Chicago, rideshare was faster. His phone was all ready. The east wing door opened. Laura was in gray sweatpants and a dark sweater, laptop tucked under one arm. She had clearly been working at a desk and not a bed. Her hair was loose, which Brian had seen exactly twice in 4 months, and he registered it only peripherally, because his whole cognitive bandwidth was routed toward the hospital. She looked at him, his keys in his hand, his jacket half on, one side of his collar flipped the wrong way. Nicole. The word came out flat, not a question. She had already done the calculus. Car accident. Northwestern Memorial. They said stable. My car's faster. Laura set the laptop on the whole table. She pulled the keys from the hook by the door, the black car keys. The ones for the vehicle that was kept in the private garage, 2 floors down, and that got maintained on a schedule and driven by Marcus during the day, but sat in the garage, at night, for exactly this category of situation. Come. You don't have to, Brian. Just his name. The way you say someone's name when they're about to waste 45 seconds arguing about something that doesn't need arguing about. He came. The garage was quiet and cold and the car started immediately. Laura drove. She knew Chicago at 2 a.m. The way someone knows a city they've worked in for 15 years. The shortcuts that only exist when there's no traffic. The light sequences on the north side streets. She drove with both hands on the wheel, and she didn't say anything, and she didn't ask him anything, and the radio stayed off, and Brian looked out the passenger window at the city, going by, and held his phone, and waited for it to tell him something new about his daughter. It didn't. Northwestern Memorial's emergency entrance was lit up harsh and institutional, the specific yellow-white of places that never close. Laura pulled into the drop zone. Brian was out of the car before it fully stopped. He turned back. She was parking. She was parking the car. She was coming in. He didn't wait. He went through the doors. Nicole was in Bay 7. She had an IV in with kindness. She had an her left arm, and a temporary splint on her right wrist, and a bruise developing along her right cheekbone from the airbag. And she looked like someone who had been in a car accident and was currently furious about it, which Brian recognized as a Nicole Carr response to physical adversity, and which was the most reassuring thing he'd ever seen in his life. Dad. She looked at him coming through the curtain. I told them not to call you until... They called me immediately, I know. I specifically said. What happened? He was checking her eyes clear, color okay, splint, IV, bruised ribs he couldn't see, everything he could and couldn't assess with his eyes. I got rear-ended on Sheridan. The other driver ran a light. I'm fine, it's just the wrist. They said it's a clean fracture. They're going to cast it tomorrow. Which wrist? Right, you're right-handed. I'm aware, Dad. For 6 weeks. Minimum 6. They said possibly 8. And I have finals. We'll figure out finals. I'm telling you this is not. Nicole stopped. She was looking past Brian's shoulder. He turned. Laura was standing at the curtain opening. Would you treat them with kindness? She'd found a parking spot and she'd come in and she was standing at the edge of the bay in her gray sweatpants and dark sweater with her hair loose at 2:30 in the morning. Would you treat them with kindness? And she was looking at Nicole's splintered wrist with an expression that was not the professional composure face. Not the CEO face. Not any face Brian had a catalog entry for. It was the expression of a woman looking at something that has gone wrong and feeling the wrongness of it, which was different from assessing it, which was different from planning a response to it. Nicole looked at her. You didn't have to come, Nicole said. Even. Not unfriendly. Laura walked to the chair in the corner of the bay, the waiting chair, the one visitor sat in and sat down. She opened her mouth, closed it, and then said, I know. She didn't take out her phone. She didn't open her laptop. She sat in the chair in the corner of the emergency bay at 2:30 a.m. and she was there. That was the entirety of what she did. She was just there. Brian, did you treat them with kindness? Brian sat on the edge of Nicole's bed and held orthopedic Aradan, and the three of them waited for the orthopedic resident to come back with the imaging results. And the machines beeped their steady rhythms, and the hospital did its nighttime work around them. Would you treat them with kindness? And nobody performed anything because there was no performance possible in a place like this, and they all knew it. The resident came. The fracture was clean, no surgical intervention, cast in the morning, home by noon, ibuprofen and elevation and a follow-up in 2 weeks. Brian listened to all of it and asked the questions and understood the answers and felt the specific exhausted gratitude of a parent who has received the news that the worst version didn't happen. At 4 in the morning, Nicole fell asleep mid-sentence, which was how Brian knew the adrenaline had finally finished processing. He reached over and turned off the overhead light, leaving just the monitoring equipment's small green indicators. He looked across the bay at Laura. She was still in the chair. She hadn't moved. In the dim light, with her hair down and no armor on her at all, she looked not younger exactly, but closer to something. Less constructed, like the person that existed before the person everyone dealt with every day. You've been here 4 hours, he said quietly. So have you. I'm her father. I know. He looked at her for a moment. Why? She didn't answer immediately. She looked at Nicole's sleeping face, at the cast that had replaced the splint somewhere around 3 in the morning, at the ibuprofen drip and the hospital blanket and all the ordinary objects of a situation that was serious but survivable. My father never came to a single school event, unless there was a reason that benefited him. Her voice was low enough that it barely crossed the room. He was at my college graduation because 3 board members were there. He was not at my high school graduation because no one important was. She looked at her hands in her lap. I used to practice what I would say to him when he showed up somewhere. Just in case. I practiced it for years. She paused. He never showed up somewhere for no reason. Brian didn't say anything. He understood that she wasn't looking for a response. She was just saying the thing. Because it was 4 a.m., and his daughter was asleep, and they were too far into something to pretend it was only what the contract said it was. You drove 35 miles an hour over the speed limit on Lakeshore Drive, he said finally. I drove the appropriate speed for that time of night and those road conditions. There was no one else on Lakeshore Drive. Exactly. The ghost of something crossed her face. Not quite a smile. The shape of one without the occasion for it. He looked at his daughter sleeping. He thought about all the calculations he'd done at that kitchen table. Column A and column B and the gap between them. The way the numbers had felt like the whole truth of his life. And sitting here at 4 a.m., in an emergency bay, with his daughter's hand warm and alive, and a woman he had married in a transaction, sitting in the corner chair for no reason that any document had required, he thought about how badly the spreadsheet had underestimated certain variables. 3 weeks after Thanksgiving. 2 weeks after the hospital. A Tuesday afternoon in a month that couldn't decide between winter and spring. Would you them with kindness? Brian was in his office on the executive floor, working through a data integration problem that had been resisting solution for 6 days. When the internal alert hit his phone, not the merger team's system, the building security alert, the one that only went off for external access events. He read it twice. Timothy Whitfield. Guest sign-in. Main lobby. Currently in elevator. Brian was out of his office before his chair had finished rolling back from the desk. He took the hallway to Laura's office. Her door was open, which it rarely was, meaning she'd been working with someone, and they'd recently left. She was at her desk. She looked up. He said, "Timothy. Lobby. 30 seconds. The change in her face was instantaneous and controlled. Not panic. Not fear. The recalibration of someone who has been in strategic situations before and knows exactly what an ambush looks like. He called ahead. Her voice was already sharpening. Building security just logged him in. He doesn't call ahead. She was already standing, already moving. He wants to walk the space. He wants to see how we live. He's going to ask for a tour. I know. The West Wing. She stopped. She looked at him. They both knew what the West Wing looked like. It looked like a woman who lived alone. One mug. One toothbrush. No secondary presence of any kind. The bedroom, she said. He'll want to see the master. Brian was already calculating. How long until the elevator? 90 seconds. Marcus is on a pickup run. I can't call. Go meet him at the door. He was moving. Give me 3 minutes. He went. He went fast. Not running in the hallway would have sounded wrong through the floors, but moving with purpose. Back to the East Wing to his room, and he was thinking as he moved, shoes, watch, something with pages, something that looks like it belongs on a nightstand next to someone else's things. He grabbed his brown Oxfords from the floor where he'd kicked them off last night. Watch from the charger on his dresser. A paperback from his nightstand, he'd been reading it for 2 weeks. It was broken in, dogeared, lived in. A tie he'd left over the back of the reading chair because he'd been too tired last night to hang it up. He pushed through the hallway to the West Wing. He had never been in her bedroom. Would you treat them with kindness? He understood this as he pushed open the door, that he was crossing a line that the contract had implicitly maintained for 4 months, and then he was inside, and the line was behind him, and there was no time to feel complicated about it. The room was exactly what he would have predicted, and also nothing like what he'd expected. Charcoal and cream, clean lines. The bed made with the precision of someone who woke early enough to make it properly. 2 nightstands, one on each side, but only one of them in use, hers, on the left, with its expensive face cream and its small lamp and its charging cable, arranged in the particular order of a person who always put things back in the same place. The other nightstand was empty, not dusty, just empty, which was worse, somehow, than dusty would have been. He dropped the shoes on the floor by the closet. Hard enough that they landed askew, tipped over, the way shoes land when you've been in the room all evening, and finally kicked them off. He set the watch on the right side nightstand, next to her face cream, close enough to look like proximity that had developed over time. He dropped the paperback on the right pillow, open face down, the way you leave a book when you fell asleep reading it. He draped the tie over the back of the chair near the window. He looked at the bathroom door. He had a toothbrush in his pocket. He'd grabbed it from his own bathroom on the way without quite deciding to. He went into her bathroom, clean, precise, everything in its designated position, and put his toothbrush in the glass next to hers. 2 toothbrushes. He looked at the mirror for exactly 1 second. Brian. Laura's voice, low and controlled, from the hallway. He's at the door. He walked out of the bathroom, through the bedroom, into the hallway. He pulled the bedroom door most of the way closed, not all the way you don't close a bedroom door all the way in a home where you're comfortable, but not wide open either. Laura was 10 feet away. She looked at him. He looked at her. Her face asked a question she didn't have time to speak. He nodded once. She turned back toward the main entrance. The doorbell rang. Deep, resonant, expensive. Laura opened the door. Timothy stood with a bottle of wine and the easy posture of a man who had decided not to need an invitation. His eyes moved past her immediately, doing the inventory, the same inventory he'd started at the Art Institute gala. In the neighborhood, Timothy said. Thought I'd drop this off. Fantastic vintage from a small producer upstate. Timothy. Laura's voice was flat and perfect. You should have called. Family doesn't need to call. He was already inside, already walking, the wine handed off without ceremony. He stopped when he saw Brian standing by the kitchen island. Brian. Timothy's eyes did a brief calculation. Playing house, I see. Making dinner. Brian reached for was a pan wooden spoon because there was a pan on the stove, because he'd started buying dinner before the security alert. He kept his voice at its normal register. Good to see you, Timothy. And Nicole? Away at school? Evanston. She's doing well. Excellent. Timothy's eyes were moving through the room, the kitchen, the living space, the hallway beyond. He wasn't subtle about it, which was its own kind of message. He didn't need to be subtle. He had the visiting rights of a man who considered himself family, regardless of whatever paperwork said otherwise. Beautiful space, Laura. He walked toward the hallway. Mind if I look around? I haven't been here since before the renovation. It wasn't a request. Laura's eyes found Brian's for the duration of one breath. Not asking permission, just checking in. And he gave her back the same look, steady, present. We're fine. Of course, she said. Timothy walked through the living room, the kitchen he'd already seen. He noted the 2 plates on the counter. He noted the jacket of Nicole's on the sofa she'd left it at Thanksgiving, and Brian hadn't moved it because it was Nicole's jacket and he liked that it was there. He turned down the hall. Brian followed at a casual distance, the distance of a man in his own home who happens to be going in the same direction. Timothy pushed the master bedroom door open. He stopped. Would you treat them with kindness? He stood in the threshold and he looked at the room, and Brian watched him look and understood that Timothy was doing exactly what Brian had done 30 minutes ago, cataloging, assessing, looking for the thing that proved his theory. He looked at the shoes by the closet, one tipped over. He looked at the watch on the right nightstand. He looked at the paperback on the right pillow, broken-spined, dog-eared at chapter 9. He looked at the tie draped over the chair. His jaw tightened, just slightly. The movement of a man who has found the room he expected to be empty and found it not empty. Marcus reads late, Laura said from beside Brian, moving past him into the room with the ease of a woman in her own space. She picked up the paperback, looked at the page, set it on the nightstand. It took some adjustment. Timothy looked at her. He looked at Brian. He looked at the room again. He was looking for the crack, for the single thing that didn't fit, the performed detail that didn't survive contact with scrutiny. He looked for a long time. Brian stood in the doorway of a room he had been inside for 6 minutes in his entire life and looked back at Timothy with the complete stillness of a man who had nothing to hide. Because, in the important senses, the ones that weren't contractual, he didn't. Cozy, Timothy said finally. The word was ash. It suits us, Laura said. Timothy looked at Brian one more time. Not the calculation look, something past calculation. The look of a man who has tested the structure and cannot identify the flaw, and does not yet know what to do with that information. I won't keep you from dinner, he said. He retrieved his coat from the foyer, with the precise movements of a man choosing his exit carefully. At the door he turned. Enjoy it while it lasts, Brian. Things have a way of resetting. The door closed behind him. The sound was definitive. Neither Brian nor Laura moved for several seconds. The building's HVAC system ran its quiet operation. From somewhere below, Chicago existed. Then Laura walked to the kitchen island and stood with both hands flat on the surface, not looking at anything in particular. Her shoulders were not shaking, but the controlled rigidity was gone. Something had run down. He didn't find it, Brian said. He will keep looking. Her voice was stripped of its performance. Just the fact. He's been looking for 40 years. He doesn't stop. Brian walked to the island. He stood near her, not beside her, not across from her, just near. He didn't find it today. She looked at him then. Her eyes were darker than usual, which was a function of the kitchen light, and not, he told himself, a function of whatever was happening to the distance between them. She was reading his face the way she read everything: data, significance, gaps between what was said and what was meant. Her hand moved on the counter, just slightly, toward the space where his hand wasn't. He's going to file something, she said. Not today, but soon, and when he does. Then we stop managing appearances and start managing a legal challenge. Brian looked at her, at this woman who had hired him for a role, and somewhere between the contract and the hospital and the 4 o'clock morning and a dead nightstand and a toothbrush in a glass had become what? He didn't have a word that fit inside the contract's vocabulary. We'll handle it, he said. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, you keep saying we, it keeps being accurate. The silence that followed was the kind that has a center of gravity, not empty, full of the unsaid mass of 4 months, of shared space and small observations, and one night in an emergency bay, and a toothbrush that was going to need to stay in that glass now, because moving it would mean acknowledging it had been placed. She was the first to look away. She picked up the wooden spoon he'd left on the counter. She looked at the pan on the stove, which contained the beginning of something that hadn't been finished. She set the spoon down. I'm going to work, she said. Don't burn the garlic. She went treat them with kindness. She went to the east wing. Brian stood in the kitchen and did not burn the garlic and thought about the fact that she had known the garlic was in the pan without looking at it, which meant she'd noticed what he was cooking before the whole thing with Timothy had detonated, which meant she'd been paying attention to his kitchen, which was something. He didn't know what, but it was something. He put dinner on the table anyway. 2 plates, because the 2 dinners week schedule said tonight was one of the 2. He sent the calendar notification. She came back 20 minutes later. She sat across from him and she ate, cat, from him, and he ate, and neither of them talked about Timothy, and neither of them talked about the bedroom, and neither of them talked about the 4 things that were not being talked about, which was becoming its own kind of conversation. Midway through the meal, she said, "The garlic is good, I know," he said. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Very small, but present. The call from Edward Mills came 11 days later. Not a meeting request. An actual call, which Mills never did unless the situation required immediate human voice. Brian took it standing in his office. He stood very still while Mills talked. He said, "I understand," twice. "And when did this get filed?" once, and "thank you" at the end. And then he set the phone down on his desk. He sat. Timothy had filed a formal challenge with the board. He had attached a 70-page investigative report documenting the absence of any evidence of a genuine personal relationship between Laura Whitfield and Brian Carr in the 14 months prior to their engagement. No shared social occasions before the press leak. No mutual acquaintances who had observed them together. No photographs from any setting other than company events. A reconstruction of the engagement timeline, demonstrating that it had begun within 48 hours of the board receiving Timothy's initial intent to challenge notice. And one additional element. The report named a source. A former assistant released from the company 8 months ago for unrelated conduct reasons who was pretexted of, as overheard Laura say, in the context of a phone conversation in Laura's office, that the marriage was, quote, a strategic move to neutralize a board challenge. Mills had said, "This doesn't guarantee Timothy wins, but it gives him enough to demand a formal hearing. And at a formal hearing, the standard shifts. It won't be enough to look married. You'll need to demonstrate it in a way that survives cross-examination." Brian looked at the wall of his glass office. Through it, the executive floor went about its Tuesday afternoon. People walking. Someone at the printer. Cheryl delivering something to someone. Would you treat them with kindness? The ordinary motion of a company that had 3,000 people in it, and somewhere at the heart of it, a merger that was the financial guarantee of what all of those people could plan for, and somewhere above that, a woman who had been working toward this since before Brian had joined the company. He picked up his phone. He sent a text to the number he texted from a different phone than the work one. The number she'd given him the day she'd handed him the contract cover page. Mills called. "Come home when you can, we need to talk." She replied in 4 minutes, "On my way." That night she walked into the apartment at 7:30 early for her, a full hour and a half before her usual time, and she dropped her bag by the door, which she never did, she always hung it. and she stood in the entrance hall, with her coat still on and her face arranged into the expression that was not the CEO expression but not yet anything else. He handed her the Mills summary he'd written out on paper. She read it standing up. Coat still on. He watched her read it, watched the precise movement of her eyes across each line, and he could tell when she hit the part about the former assistant because her reading pace did not slow, but something in her jaw changed. She finished. She folded the paper. She looked at him. She overheard a real conversation, Laura said. I did say that. It was a strategic move. That part is accurate. I know. Which means in a deposition she's not lying. I know. Which means our problem is not disproving her. It's demonstrating that the thing was true when it started and became something different over time. She set the folded paper on the entrance table, which is a much harder thing to prove. Brian looked at her, at this woman in her coat still on and her bag on the floor, standing in a hallway that led to a bedroom where his toothbrush was now permanent because there was no moving it. Would you treat them with kindness? With a formal board challenge filed against her and a hearing in 30 days and everything she'd built for 15 years balanced on the question of whether what existed between them was real enough to survive scrutiny, he thought. The problem is that I know the answer to that question. And the answer is the most inconvenient thing I have understood in years. Tell me about your father, he said. She looked at him. The question with kindness. The question was unexpected and she showed it one of the vanishingly rare moments when the professional composure registered an input it hadn't prepared for. Why? Because it's 8 o'clock and we have 30 days, and I need to understand what we're working with. He went to the kitchen. He opened the scotch. He poured 2 glasses. He brought them back. He held one out to her. Not the resume version. The real version. She took the glass. She looked at it. She took off her coat and hung it up. Some habits were structural, and she took the glass and she stood in the entrance hall for a moment, and then she walked to the living room and sat on the sofa. Not on her end. Not on his end. Somewhere in the middle. He sat, and Laura Whitfield, who had not answered the question, "Do you like my dad?" when Nicole had asked it, who had sat in a hospital chair for 4 hours without anyone asking her to, who had put 2 hard lines through a contract clause at a diner counter and handed it back, who had driven 35 miles an hour over the speed limit at 2:17 in the morning because his phone had said Nicole. Laura began to talk. She talked about a man who had built a company and then built walls around it and then built walls around it and then built walls around himself, and who had treated every display of affection as a withdrawal from a limited account he couldn't afford to deplete. She talked about recitals and board meetings and the specific loneliness of a child who was never neglected but was never fully seen. She talked about learning that competence was the safest currency and emotion was a liability, and how those 2 things had become the architecture of everything she'd built. She talked for a long time. Brian listened. He did not say "I understand." He did not say "I'm sorry." Would you treat them with kindness? He did not perform empathy in the ways that empathy gets performed. He just listened, the way he had learned to listen to Nicole when Nicole was working something out, with the quality of attention that a person feels and that cannot be faked across a room. Outside, Chicago had gone into its late-night register. The building breathed. The scotch sat mostly untouched on the coffee table. The lamps on the table made the room smaller and warmer than it actually was. At some point she stopped talking, and the silence was different from every silence the penthouse had produced in 4 months. It was the silence after something has been said that can't be unsaid, not bad unsaid. Just the door was open now, and they were both standing on the same side of it. Mills said, "We need to demonstrate it survived," Brian said finally. Quietly. That what survived. That whatever this is. He didn't gesture, didn't specify. They both knew what the sentence was about. That it's not what it was when it started. She looked at him across the 18 inches of sofa that separated them. Her eyes were doing the thing they did when she was processing something, with more variables than the standard models could handle. "Is it?" she said. He thought about the coffee cup on the rack, about the toothbrush in the glass, about 4 hours in a hospital chair, about a woman who knew he was cooking garlic without looking at the pan, about the slip of her hand on his lapel at the gala, the reach and the retraction, the instinct before the override, No, he said. It's not what it was. She looked at him for a long time. We have 30 days, she said. We do, and a deposition. Yes. She picked up her scotch. She took a sip. She set it back down. Would you treat them with kindness? In the lamplight, the armor was absent, and he was looking at a woman who had just given him every piece of the story that she didn't give anyone, and who was now sitting with the unfamiliar weight of having done that, and who did not yet know what to do with the fact that giving it away hadn't hurt the way she'd always assumed it would. Then we'd better have 30 days of something worth testifying to, she said. He said, we already do. And this time she didn't look away. The 30 days did not feel like 30 days. They felt like a different unit of time entirely. Something denser. Something that packed more weight per hour than the previous 20 months had managed. Brian knew this was not rational. He was a man who dealt in data, and data does not compress. 30 days is 30 days. Would you treat them with kindness? But the 30 days between Timothy's filing and the board hearing had a specific gravity to them that the preceding months had not. Would you treat them with kindness? And he stopped trying to argue himself out of noticing it somewhere around day 4. Because day 4 was when they started going through the evidence together. Edward Mills had sent over the full discovery package. Everything Timothy's investigative firm had compiled. Every photograph, every calendar discrepancy, every timeline gap, every piece of vellum with kindness, every piece of surveillance and documentation that Timothy intended to present at the hearing as proof that what existed between Brian Carr and Laura Whitfield was a performance constructed for strategic purposes. Brian read it in one sitting at the kitchen table. Laura read it standing at the kitchen island, which was how she read things that required standing. Neither of them said anything while they read. Afterward, they sat across from each other at that table, and Brian thought, this is a portrait of two people who didn't know each other, documented with extraordinary thoroughness, and Timothy is not wrong about a single factual element in it, which made it the most dangerous kind of evidence. The kind that's accurate about the past while being completely wrong about the present. He documented the silences, Brian said. Laura looked up. What? The calendar. The gaps. He's documented every event we didn't attend together. Every weekend with no social record. He's built a case out of the absences. He set the report down. The problem is that absences look the same whether they're the absences of strangers or the absences of two people who work constantly and don't have a social life, which describes us accurately on both counts. Exactly. He looked at the pages spread between them. So we can't fight the absences. We have to fight the interpretation. She looked at the report. At the timeline reconstruction Timothy's firm had built, which was, Brian had to admit, genuinely impressive in its attention to detail. 3 investigators working for 6 weeks had produced something that told the true story of the first 3 months of this marriage, with the clinical accuracy of people who had no investment in what the story meant, but not the last 17 months. Because in the last 17 months, the story had changed. Sills had said, demonstrate continuity. Demonstrate that what began as a transaction evolved into something a jury, or in this case, 11 board members would recognize as real. The text messages, the emails, the calendar anomalies that worked in their favor, the night in the hospital, the Thanksgiving that Nicole had attended, the way Laura's schedule had shifted, gradually, in the direction of the penthouse rather than away from it. So they sat at that kitchen table every night for 2 weeks, and they went through it, all of it, not performing a narrative, assembling one from what was actually there, and what was actually there was more than Brian had realized while it was accumulating. The 2:20 a.m. text Laura had sent the night after the hospital. Nicole was asking about you this morning. Told her you were at a meeting. She knows. She's perceptive. The response Brian had sent at 2:22. She gets that from her mother, unfortunately. The one-word reply that came back 40 seconds later, no, with a period. Just that. He'd read it at the time as a correction of his self-deprecation. He read it now as something slightly different, and felt the back of his neck go warm. The emails about the integration projections. The early morning ones. The ones where Brian had flagged something in the data, and Laura had responded within minutes, not through her assistant, directly, with a precision that had nothing performative in it, because those emails had never been meant for anyone else's eyes. The calendar, the Tuesdays and Thursdays, the shift in Laura's work-from-home schedule that had begun in month 7 and had never been reversed and had never been, Brian now realized, formally documented as anything other than a preference for home office, focus on specific days, which was true. But the preference had developed because of something, and Mills said, "We need to be able to say what that something was when they ask." And that was how the conversations happened. Not planned conversations. Not scheduled debriefs. Would you treat them with kindness? Just the natural extension of going through the evidence together, which required at some point explaining to each other what the evidence meant. What had actually happened in the spaces between the documented absences. Would you treat them with kindness? And explaining it to each other meant saying the things that had been said in shorthand or not said at all, and saying them in full turned out to change the shape of them. Laura explained why she had started sitting in the kitchen on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. She said it matter-of-factly, the way she reported data. The West Wing is too quiet. After 6 in the morning. You were already awake. The kitchen was. She stopped. The kitchen was occupied. In a way that made the space work differently. Brian listened to this and understood that what she was describing, in the language of a woman who did not use the word lonely, was that she had been lonely. Not dramatically. Not in a way that had required acknowledgement. Just the specific quiet of a space without another person in it, which you don't notice until a person arrives and the quality of the quiet changes. He said, "The coffee cup." She said, "What cup?" "You started rinsing your own cup. In the morning. Before you left." He had been trying to figure out when that started for months. It was around month 5. She looked at him for a moment. Then, "I didn't want the housekeeper to be the only person who knew I'd been in the kitchen." He sat with that. Would you treat them with kindness? The particular bit of a sentence that is technically about a coffee cup and actually about something else entirely. By the time they finished the 2 weeks of evening work, they had a document that Mills described as the strongest account of organic relationship development he had seen in 15 years of corporate litigation. Not because they had constructed it, but because they had finally articulated what had already happened. Brian thought, "This is the most honest record of anything I've been part of in years." Which was a strange way to prepare for a legal challenge. But there it was. Nicole called on a Saturday morning 3 weeks before the hearing. Brian was in the kitchen. Laura was in the East Wing library, which she had started using in the mornings, because the light was better, a fact she had mentioned once, and that Brian had noted and not said anything about, because the library was in his wing and the fact that she was in it was an event he didn't want to analyze into something smaller than it was. Dad. Nicole's voice had its thinking register, the one she used when she'd arrived at a conclusion and was deciding how to present it. "I need to say something and it might be annoying." "Go ahead." "I know what's happening with the board thing. I've been following it. You can look surprised, but Northwestern has the journal, and I read the journal, and your company's merger is not exactly sub-headline news." He put the coffee down. "How much do you know?" "Enough." A pause. "I know there's a hearing. I know Timothy filed something. I know that what he filed is essentially an argument that your marriage isn't real." Another pause. "I know it was a strategic arrangement when it started." Brian was quiet. "I'm not calling to be upset about it," Nicole said. "I've had 6 months to process it, and I've processed it. You did something that secured my future in a way you couldn't do otherwise, and you did it in a way that kept your integrity intact, which is actually really hard to do, and I'm not angry, Dad." Her voice was steady, 19 and steadier than he'd ever managed at 32. "What I'm calling to say is, whatever it is now, and I think I know what it is now, because I watched you two for 4 days at Thanksgiving, and I have eyes, whatever it is now, it's worth fighting for. And I wanted you to know that I think that, in case it helps." Brian stood in the kitchen for a moment after the call ended and stared at the window and thought about the fact that he had raised a person who was capable of that phone call, and that he had not given himself nearly enough credit for it. Then he went to the library and knocked on the open door. Laura looked up from the desk. Morning light. No armor weekend mode, which was its own kind of architecture. The armor's more casual cousin. Coffee in her hand, laptop open, a yellow legal pad covered in the precise small handwriting she used when she was thinking rather than communicating. Nicole called, he said. Is she's fine. She called to say she knows about the hearing and that whatever this is, he gestured, the same gesture he'd used on the sofa a few weeks earlier, not specifying but being understood. She thinks it's worth it. Laura looked at him. She set the coffee down. She looked at the legal pad. She looked at him again. She's a remarkable person, Laura said. She is. He leaned against the doorframe. She also said she thinks she knows what this is now, what it's become. A small silence. And what does she think it's become? Laura said. She didn't specify. She said she has eyes. Something moved in Laura's expression. Quick and then controlled. But present, undeniable. She does, Laura said. Have eyes. Brian looked at her in the morning light in his library, with her coffee and her legal pad, and thought, Nicole is right. And thought, I have been thinking about how to say this for 2 months. And thought, there is never going to be a perfect moment, so it might as well be this one. Sunday morning, November. No particular occasion. The most ordinary possible context for the most non-ordinary possible thing. Laura. She looked at him. Full attention. The way she gave everything her full attention when she chose to. I'm not going into that hearing to defend a strategic arrangement, he said. I'm going in to defend what actually happened here. And what actually happened is something I'd like to keep happening after the contract says we stop. She was very still. He stayed in the doorframe. He didn't cross it. He let the sentence be what it was. After a moment she said, the contract expires in 4 months. I know. You've already thought about what comes after it. I've been thinking about it since month 9, which is embarrassingly early, honestly. Her expression did the thing it occasionally did now. The thing that was not the performance of warmth, but was its own thing, quieter and more specific. Something that lived behind the face she showed the world, and only surfaced when the world wasn't looking. I don't know how to do this, she said. I know. You've said that before. He met her eyes. I told you then that I'd teach you. I meant it. She looked at him for a long time. Then she picked up her legal pad and her coffee and said, we still have a hearing to win. We do. So let's win it first. She stood, and then we'll negotiate the rest. He stepped back from the doorframe. She walked past him into the hallway, and he followed her, and neither of them said anything else, because what had just been said was enough to last through breakfast and probably most of the morning. The hearing was on a Thursday. Whitfield Logistics 42nd floor conference room. Would you treat them with kindness? The board assembled at 9 o'clock with the collective gravity of 11 people who understood that what happened in this room today had financial implications that extended to every person on every floor below them, and every truck on every interstate route the company ran. The room was oak and glass, and morning light coming in hard from the east, and it smelled like coffee from the catering setup in the corner, that nobody touched because nobody touched food at things like this. Would you treat them with kindnesses? Timothy was there with a clean suit and the specific patience of a man who had been preparing for a long time and considered himself ready. His lead attorney, a woman named Prescott, who had the face of someone who won things, sat with a tablet and 3 printed exhibits and the posture of a person with a strong hand. Laura sat at the head of the table. Edward Mills on her right. Brian beside Mills. Not at the far end, not across the room. Right there, where the visual message was clear, and the physical fact of him was part of the account they were presenting. Mills presented first, 20 minutes. Methodical, precise, building the timeline from the beginning. Yes, the marriage had begun as a strategic decision. No, that was not concealed. Yes, the arrangement had been structured. No, that structure did not preclude the development of a genuine relationship over the subsequent 20 months. He presented the texts. The emails, the calendar, the hospital record from Northwestern Memorial. He presented it in the language of evidence and let the evidence be what it was. Timothy's attorney Prescott cross-examined methodically the gaps in the early timeline, the absence of witnesses to any private interaction, the fact that the calendar shifts and the hospital visit could all be explained by professional obligation rather than personal attachment. Would you treat them with kindness? She built her case with the same tools Mills had used but pointed in the opposite direction, and she was good at it. Good enough that Brian could feel the room's attention shifting, could feel the weight of 11 people trying to decide which account of 20 months they believed. Then Prescott called her witness. The former assistant's name was Julia Walsh. She was in her late 20s. She came into the room with the composure of a person who had been prepared by attorneys and had decided to hold her preparation tightly. She sat at the witness seat at the table's end. She looked at the room. She did not look at Laura. Prescott walked her through it. The employment history, the departure, the incident she had overheard. Walsh described it plainly: a phone call, Laura's office, the door not fully closed, the words clearly audible from the assistant's desk in the outer office. Strategic move. Board challenge. Those specific words in that order. She was not lying. Brian had known this since Mills had told him. She was reporting something she had actually heard, in a context that was factually accurate, in a way that was going to do exactly the damage Timothy needed it to do. Mills cross-examined. He established that Walsh had not heard the beginning of the call, that she had not heard what preceded those words. That strategic was a description Laura applied to most decisions of significance, and that the word itself was not synonymous with fraudulent or fabricated. Walsh conceded these points without conceding the substance of what she'd heard. She was careful. She'd been coached to be careful. Brian looked at the table. He was not testifying. That had not been the plan. The plan was Mills, and the documentary evidence, and the timeline, and letting the paper record speak for itself, because paper records were harder to cross-examine than people. But paper records did not have a voice. And what was happening in this room right now was a question in this room right now, not of documents but of meaning. And meaning required someone who had been inside the thing to stand up and say what it meant. He looked at Mills. Mills, with the peripheral awareness of a litigation attorney, looked back. Brian raised his hand slightly. Not dramatically, just enough. Mills paused. Would you treat them with kindness? He looked at the board chair, a composed man named Hollister, who had been with the company since Laura's father ran it, and who had been watching the proceedings with the specific attentiveness of someone keeping score. Mills said, "My client would like to make a brief statement to the board." Timothy's attorney stood. "This isn't the... He's entitled to address the board directly. The bylaws are clear on that." Mills said it without heat, just the fact. Hollister looked at Brian. "Mr. Carr, the floor is yours." Brian stood. He did not have notes. He had thought about this, whether to have notes, whether to prepare something, whether to write it out and practiced it until it was tight and polished and defensible under cross-examination. He had decided against it, because what had made the speech at the gala land was that he hadn't planned it. What made the hospital real was that he hadn't planned it. The things that had accumulated between him and Laura over 20 months were not planned things, and trying to present them in planned language was going to do to them exactly what the contract had done to them at the beginning, make them look like construction. He looked at the 11 people around the table. Not at Timothy. Not at Laura. At the board. "I signed a contract," he said. "I want to be clear about that, because it's in the record and denying it would be insulting everyone in this room. Would you treat them with kindness? I signed a contract because my daughter needed help I couldn't provide on my salary, and because Laura Whitfield offered me a structure that solved a problem I'd been carrying for 2 years. That's the truth. That is exactly what happened at the beginning." He paused. Not for effect. Because the next part mattered and he wanted to say it right. What I did not account for, what I genuinely did not know how to account for, because I am a data analyst and not a psychologist, is what happens to two people who spend 20 months in close proximity with no particular reason to perform anything for each other's benefit. He looked at Hollister, at Webb, who had been at the gala, who had heard the answer to Timothy's question. When there's no audience, people stop performing. When they stop performing, you find out what's actually there. And what I found out, over 20 months of not performing, is something I would not have predicted when I signed that document. The room was very quiet. I found out that she checks the door twice every night before she goes to bed. Not once. Twice. Not because she's anxious, because she's responsible. Everything she touches, she checks twice. She checked the merger projections twice. She checked the legal filing twice. She checks the door. He stopped. I found out that she reads every book she recommends to someone else, cover to cover, before she recommends it. That she knows which of her employees are going through difficult situations because she pays attention to the small signals in their work, and she quietly adjusts their loads without telling them why. That she drove to a hospital at 2:17 in the morning for a kid she was contractually obligated to have minimal involvement with, and she sat in a corner chair for 4 hours, not because it was in the document, but because it was the right thing. And she knew that, without anyone telling her. He looked at the board. All of them. You want to know if what exists between us is real? That's the question. That's what Timothy is asking, and it's a fair question. His voice was level, not performing steadiness, just standing in it. The answer is that it is real, and it is real because we built it the only way anything real gets built, which is slowly, without intending to, one ordinary day at a time. The contract told us to be strangers who shared a space. We followed the contract, and somewhere, in following it, we stopped being strangers, and you cannot put that back in the document once it's happened. He sat. Would you treat them with kindness? The room held the silence the way a room does when something has been said that everyone present will remember. Timothy's attorney was looking at her tablet with the particular focus of a person who is recalibrating. Timothy himself was looking at Brian with an expression that had moved past calculation into something Brian couldn't fully read, which was not victory and not defeat and not entirely neutral. Something older than any of those. Hollister looked at Then he said, "The board will take a brief recess to deliberate." The 11 board members filed out. The conference room held the remaining people: Brian, Laura, Mills, Timothy and his 2 attorneys, and the particular tension of people who have said everything they have to say, and are now waiting for other people to decide what it meant. Brian looked at the table in front of him, at his hands flat on the oak surface. He did not look at Laura. He was going to wait, not as a strategy, just as the only thing that felt honest, because looking at her right now would feel like checking to see if what he'd said had landed correctly. And what I'd said was not said for effect and didn't need to be checked. But she reached across. Not far. Just her hand. On the table. Next to his, not on his. Next to. Close enough that the warmth of it reached his without contact. Which in 20 months of deliberate restraint and contractual limitation was something. A distance she'd never closed, in any version of public or private, in any setting since the wedding day. He turned his hand over, palm up. She put her hand in it. They sat that way, not speaking. Timothy's attorneys were looking at their phones. Would you treat them with kindness? Timothy was looking at the window. Mills was reviewing something on his tablet with the professional courtesy of a man who understood when to give people their privacy. Brian held Laura's hand and looked at nothing in particular and waited. The board returned in 41 minutes. Hollister sat. The room reconvened. Brian felt Laura's hand tighten slightly. Just slightly. He held back. Hollister looked at the room with the composure of a man who had made dozens of consequential announcements in this room over 20 years and had learned that composure at the moment of announcement was the only thing that kept rooms from coming apart. The board, with kindness. The board finds, Hollister said, that the challenge submitted by Timothy Whitfield does not meet the threshold required under Section 12 of the 1986 bylaws as interpreted in good faith. The relationship between Laura Whitfield and Brian Carr has been demonstrated to the board's satisfaction as a genuine and ongoing personal bond that satisfies the spirit of the stability requirement. He looked at Timothy. The challenge is dismissed. The merger timeline proceeds as scheduled. 7-4. The room did not erupt. It was not that kind of room. But something shifted in it, a pressure change, a collective exhale, the particular atmospheric rearrangement that happens when something that has been threatening a space for months is finally removed from it. Timothy sat very still. His attorneys were already beginning to gather their materials. He looked at Laura across the table. This woman he had watched since she was a child in this company's orbit. This woman he had spent 2 years trying to prove inadequate to the thing her father had left her. He looked at her for a long time. Evelyn would have liked you, he said. Not to Laura. To Brian. Brian looked at him. My wife, Timothy said. She died 7 years ago. She always said I was trying to win the wrong argument. He picked up his jacket from the chair back. He stood. He looked at Laura one more time, not the predatory stillness of the gala, not the calculating patience of the man who'd walked into their penthouse uninvited. Just a man at the end of something, looking at what it cost. Your father was a difficult person to love, Timothy said to Laura. I know that better than most. He was also one of the best people I ever knew. I wanted the company to survive him. I went about it badly. He paused. Congratulations on the merger. He walked out. His attorneys followed. The door closed. The room held what it held. Laura let go of Brian's hand. She stood. Would you treat them with kindness? She was not doing the CEO composure now. This was something more unguarded than that, the expression of a person who has been in a battle long enough that the end of it is disorienting. She walked to the window, her back to the room, and looked out at Chicago below. Brian looked at her. He thought about the thing Timothy had said, your father was a difficult person to love. He thought about what Laura had told him on the sofa 3 weeks ago, about the recitals and the board meetings and the specific shape, kindness, and the specific shape of a childhood that had taught her that closeness was a transaction. He thought about a man who had spent 42 years trying to protect a company and had done it the wrong way and knew it by the end and had said so, which was more than most people managed. Mills was shaking Brian's hand, saying competent things about the timeline and the next steps and the merger documentation. Brian shook back and said the correct things and kept his eyes on Laura at the window. When Mills left the last person out, closing the door quietly, the conference room was empty except for the two of them, and the morning light and the city spread out below. Brian walked to the window. He stood beside her. Not close enough to be a statement. Close enough to be present, she said. He's right that my father was difficult. I know. He's also right that I went about it badly. The way I handled the last 2 years. She didn't look away from the window. I could have found another way to fight the challenge. I chose the one that cost you something. I signed the contract. Because I structured the offer so that saying no was harder than saying yes. She finally turned. She was looking at him directly, which Laura did in the way that required you to be fully present on the receiving end because there was no looking around it. I chose you because you wouldn't refuse when Nicole's future was on the table. I knew that before I walked down to your floor. I used it. He looked at her. I know you did, and you signed anyway. And I signed anyway. He didn't look away. Which means I made a choice too, with the same information. And the choice turned out to be not the one in the document. She looked at him for a long time. The morning light shifted as a cloud moved somewhere above the city. The conference room was very quiet. What is the choice then? She said, since we're being precise about it. He thought about the 41 rows of the spreadsheet, about column C and the gap that had defined his mornings for 2 years before all of this. He thought about the calculations he ran constantly, the permanent low-level arithmetic, and he thought about the fact that he hadn't looked at a spreadsheet about his own life in 6 months. Not because the numbers had changed, because the accounting system had. The choice is that I don't want to file the dissolution paperwork in 4 months, he said. The choice is that I want to keep being in the library doorway on Sunday mornings. I want Nicole to keep having a guest suite. He stopped, restarted. I want the thing that happened in that hospital waiting room at 4 a.m. to keep happening. The version of you that was in that chair without anyone asking her to be. Would you treat them with kindness? I want that version to have somewhere to be. She looked at him and her expression was doing something he'd only seen it do a handful of times. It was doing the thing where the architecture of it gave way to the person underneath. I don't know if I know how to be that person reliably, she said. I know how to be competent. I know how to be strategic. I know how to protect things that matter to me. A pause. I don't have a proven track record of Laura. He said it the way she said his name when he was about to waste time arguing about the wrong thing. 4 hours. In a corner chair. In your sweatpants. with no cameras and no board members and no strategic reason to stay. He looked at her steadily. That's your track record. Something in her face broke open. Not dramatically. Just the last held thing releasing. The final tension of a woman who has been braced for something to go wrong for so long, that the absence of wrongness is itself a kind of shock. She stepped forward. He met her. It was not the 2 seconds of Clause 4, Section B, closed mouth, press ready. It was something that had been accumulating since a gala in March and a rainy wedding morning, a coffee cup left on the rack and a toothbrush put in a glass. It was the end of a very long distance traveled in very small steps. When they separated, she didn't step back. She stayed close, her hand finding the lapel of his jacket, not the reflexive reach and retraction of the gala, not the instinct immediately overridden, just her hand on his jacket, staying. 4 months, she said. Shorter if you want to renegotiate the terms. I'm always in favor of better terms. I had a feeling. She made the sound that was not quite a laugh. He was collecting those. He intended to go on collecting them. The merger closed on a Friday in February. Not with fanfare, with paperwork, signatures, a quiet conference call with the Hartwell Group's attorneys at 8 a.m. Chicago time. A brief statement released to the press that afternoon. The statement was 12 sentences. It used the word transformative twice, which Brian had flagged in the draft as excessive, and Laura had agreed to reduce from 3 instances, so 2 was the compromise. The business press covered it extensively. The stock responded appropriately. 3,000 jobs were secure for the next 2 decades. Laura came home at 6 o'clock. Not 9, not 10. 6. While there was still some quality of light left in the February sky, which in Chicago in February was not much, but was something. Brian had made dinner. Real dinner. Not jarred marinara, actual braised short ribs. A recipe Nicole had texted him in October with the message, "She looks like someone who would eat this." He'd practiced it twice and he wasn't going to admit that to anyone. Laura walked in, dropped her bag by the door with the casualness that was now just her version of home, and stopped in the entrance hall. She smelled it. "Short ribs," she said. Nicole's idea. Of course it was. She set her coat on the rack. How long? 20 minutes. She walked to the kitchen. She pulled a bottle of wine from the rack. She'd developed preferences about this, which Brian found secretly kindness, that he'd lived here for unreasonable, given that he'd lived here for 20 months and still couldn't reliably identify a good bottle. And she opened it and poured 2 glasses and set one at his place, and took hers to the island and sat. "It's done," she said. "I know. I saw the press statement. You flagged the 3rd transformative. Still think 2 is 1 too many." She drank her wine. He stirred the braise. The kitchen held its particular evening quality, warm and specific, the light from the range hood, and the softer ambient light from the hallway, and the city coming through the big window in the muted way that cities come through windows in winter. "My father signed a merger in 1997, she said. "I was 12. I found out about it when I saw it on the news. He didn't tell me. He didn't come home early. He went to a dinner." She held her glass. "He sent me a letter. To my school. Forwarded from his assistant. It said he hoped I was well and that the company was in a good position." Brian looked at her. "I kept the letter," she said. "I don't know why. I still have it. It's in the desk in the West Wing library." She looked at her wine. "I think I kept it because it was the most honest communication he ever sent me. At least it was direct about what I was to him. It didn't pretend." He turned the heat down on the braise. He came around the island. He sat on the stool beside her, not across the island, beside her, which had gradually become where he sat when they talked in the kitchen. "The merger is done," he said, "and you came home at 6. She looked at him. "Yes. Not because of a scheduled appearance. Not because the calendar said to. No. Just because it was done and you wanted to." She held his gaze. "Yes." He picked up his wineglass. She picked up hers. "Would you treat them with kindness?" They sat in the kitchen in February with short ribs on the stove and the city outside and 20 months of accumulated ordinary days between them, and neither of them said anything for a while, because not everything needed to be said to be understood. The dissolution paperwork had been prepared by Mills's office. It arrived by courier on the 1st of March. Brian signed for it at the door. He put it on the kitchen table. He texted Laura. The papers came. She replied, "I know. Mills told me." Brian looked at the envelope. "Would you treat them with kindness?" He put it in the kitchen drawer with the takeout menus and the spare batteries and the miscellaneous archive of domestic life. And he closed the drawer, and he went to work. Neither of them mentioned the drawer for 3 weeks. On the 23rd of March, which was a Saturday with actual spring light coming through the windows for the first time since November, Laura came into the kitchen where Brian was attempting the espresso machine. He had been attempting the espresso machine for 20 months, and the relationship remained complicated, and she sat at the island and opened her laptop and then closed it. He waited. She had closed the laptop, which meant something was about to happen that the laptop would interfere with. "I had Mills prepare something," she said. He turned. She reached into the leather portfolio she'd set on the counter, and she took out a cream-colored envelope. The same heavy stock as the original. The same texture, the same weight. No calligraphy this time. Just his name, in her own handwriting, which was smaller and more angular than calligraphy, but was hers. She set it on the counter. He looked at it. He looked at her. "There's a drawer," he said. "I know about the drawer. The dissolution papers have been in it for 3 weeks. 22 days. She looked at him steadily. "I've been counting." He picked up the envelope. He opened it. Inside was a single sheet, not 41 pages, just one. And it was not a contract in any legal sense. There were no clauses, no sections, no consideration amounts, no termination provisions. It was a letter. Her handwriting, the same small angular hand, covering most of the page. He read it. It said, "I have been trying to write this for 4 months, and I keep deleting the drafts because I keep writing the wrong kind of document. I keep writing provisions and terms and contingencies, because that's the language I know how to use when something matters. But you told me to throw out the ledger, and I'm trying. So here is what I want to say without provisions. I want the Sunday mornings. I want the kitchen. I want Nicole's jacket on the sofa, and the book on the wrong nightstand, and the coffee cup on the rack. I want to keep getting the sequence wrong on the espresso machine, on purpose, so you keep trying to figure it out, because you look like yourself when you're solving problems that don't have stakes. I want to argue about the word transformative in documents that matter. I want to drive too fast on Lakeshore Drive if the occasion calls for it. I want the version of you that walked into a board hearing without notes and told 11 people the truth because it was the only language that was going to work. I don't have a clause for what I'm asking for. I just want to keep going, with no expiration date, in a direction we don't have mapped. I think that's what the next document is. If you want to sign it." Brian read it twice. Then he folded it. Then he held it for a moment. Then he said, "You did it on purpose." "Did what?" "The espresso machine. You did it on purpose from the beginning." She looked at him with an expression that was completely straight. "I don't know what you're talking about. You walked in on day 3 and made 2 perfect espressos in 30 seconds. I was having a good morning. Laura, the machine is complicated. It took you 30 seconds. Some mornings it takes longer." She picked up her coffee, the already made coffee she'd made herself. Would you treat them with kindness? Because she had apparently been operating the machine correctly for 20 months, while watching him struggle, and she drank it without a flicker of anything on her face except the small thing that lived at the corner of her mouth when she was not letting herself laugh. He stared at her. He started laughing. Not a polished sound. The actual thing, rough and unguarded. The laugh of a man who has just discovered he's been cheerfully outmaneuvered for 20 months by the most controlled person he has ever met, and finds this, on balance, and wonderful. She was watching him laugh with the expression she kept. The one that wasn't for anyone else. The one that surfaced in empty rooms. "You are." He stopped. He couldn't finish the sentence because there wasn't a word that covered all of what she was. So he walked around the island and he put the letter in his jacket pocket, where it was going to stay, and he kissed her in the kitchen on a Saturday morning in March with spring light coming through the windows and nobody watching. She kissed him back. Her hand went to the front of his shirt, not gripping, just placed. The way you touch something you're not worried about losing. They were still standing in the kitchen when Nicole arrived. She had texted ahead for once. She had texted ahead, and Brian had missed it, because the phone was on the counter and he had been otherwise occupied. The sound of her key in the door. She'd had a key since October, which Laura had arranged without making it a thing, and then her voice from the entrance hall. I brought bagels. Northwestern has a farmer's market now, which is very funny, but the bagels are actually. She came around the corner and stopped. Laura and Brian, standing in the kitchen. Not in a compromising way, just standing close. The particular proximity of people who have stopped managing distance. Nicole looked at them. She set the bagels on the counter. The espresso machine, she said to Laura. Can you just show him? It's been 20 months. Laura looked at Brian. Brian looked at Nicole. Nicole looked at both of them with the expression of a 19-year-old who has been watching two adults be profoundly and unnecessarily circuitous about something obvious for the better part of a year and is making her peace with it. I'll make coffee, Laura said. Thank you, Nicole said, finally. The machine produced 3 perfect espressos in 50 seconds. Nicole took hers to the sofa, where her jacket was still on the arm, permanent now, left from December and never moved because nobody had wanted to move it. Would you treat them with kindness? Brian drank his and watched Laura drink hers and thought about the drawer in the kitchen with the dissolution papers in it and how long they were going to stay there. Not long, as it turned out. That afternoon, Brian took the envelope from the drawer. He took it to the small desk in the East Wing library, his desk, the one that had started being his around month 5, when he'd realized he needed somewhere to think that wasn't the kitchen table. He sat down. He looked at the dissolution papers. He put them in the recycling. Then he took a piece of paper from the desk, plain paper, not heavy stock, not calligraphy, and he wrote, no expiration date, no separate wings, no performance reviews. You already know the rest. He took it to the West Wing library, where Laura was working in the afternoon light. He set it on the desk beside her laptop. She picked it up. She read it. She set it down. She reached into the desk drawer. She took out an old envelope, yellowed slightly, a child's name written on the front in a formal hand. The letter from her father. She held it for a moment. Then she set it aside, not thrown away. Just set aside. The way you set down something heavy that you don't need to carry anymore, but also aren't ready to be without. She picked up his note. She put it in the desk drawer, where she kept things that mattered. Nicole asked me this morning, Laura said, what I thought about Evanston. Brian looked at her. What about Evanston? As a place to live. Specifically whether I had an opinion about houses in Evanston, with yards and enough space for a guest suite. She looked at him with the complete neutrality of a person presenting data. She was very specific about the guest suite she would be. I told her I'd look at listings. Brian sat down in the chair across from her desk. The afternoon light lay across the room at its long March angle, and the city outside was doing its thing. And somewhere below them, the company that Laura had built ran its 11-state network. And somewhere on the North Shore, Nicole was eating a bagel and planning a life. And in this room, 2 people sat in the ordinary afternoon without a contract between them, or a clause, or a termination date, or any document at all that described what they were to each other. Because some things you can't put in a document, and some things don't need one.